Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this lunchtime event on behaviour change and climate change. My name is Nick Pearce. I'm Professor of Public Policy at the University of Bath and Director of the Institute for Policy Research, and I'm going to be chairing the lunchtime event today. Very pleased to be able to do so. It's obviously the opening this week as we speak of COP27 in Egypt, major and important milestone in climate diplomacy. Addressing the challenges we face. Already, huge arguments taking place at that COP about the actions needed to take to keep us within a chance of staying at 1.5 degrees warming in our planet. Today, we're going to look particularly at the contribution that can be made by behaviour change by individuals, by businesses, by households, by communities. So thinking about how we mobilise change in our communities, as well as the big structural, regulatory, institutional changes that are being discussed at COP, but thinking how those take place alongside the changes that we make in our communities, in our businesses, in our local environments. And we've got 4 speakers for you today. We're as it were, framing and hinging this discussion off a recent House of Lords Environment and Climate Change Committee report on behaviour change, mobilising action on climate change and environment, and the behaviour change elements of that, recently published. And our first speaker is Baroness Kate Parmenter, who chairs that committee in the House of Lords, led the inquiry, and she'll be speaking about the report, about what the Lords Committee was attempting to address there. She's got significant policy interest in this area: energy and the environment, agriculture, animals, food, rural affairs as well, and also on mental health. So very pleased in a minute to ask Kate to kick us off. She'll be followed by Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh, my colleague at the University of Bath, where she is the director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, and she is an environmental psychologist specialising in perceptions and behaviour in relation to climate change, energy and transport. And Lorraine was a special advisor to the inquiry, to the Lord's inquiry that led to the committee report I just mentioned. She will be followed, Lorraine will be followed by Hira Khan Adawan from the organisation Possible, where she heads up its work on car-free cities, seeking to mobilise grassroots commitments in communities to making cars obsolete in our cities, accelerating the move to a zero-carbon Britain. Possible has a small team of people working across the UK, doing big things at the local level to tackle climate change. Registered Foundation works in places like Bristol and elsewhere. So very much looking forward to hearing from Hira Khan. And then finally, Nick Mulhall, who is Executive Director of the Aldersgate Group. He's going to talk particularly about the contribution that businesses can make. The Aldersgate Group is a politically impartial, multi-stakeholder alliance that champions a prosperous net zero emissions and environmentally sustainable economy. So leads on their work on sustainability issues, and formerly, until recently, head of climate change and energy policy at WWF UK. So really well qualified to talk about these questions for us too. So great lineup for you. We're going to have a presentation from each of our panelists. Then we've got opportunity for Q&A. If you submit your questions in the chat function, we'll aggregate those up, and I'll then parcel them up and hand them out to our panel to respond and to discuss. We've got until 1:30, so plenty of time. So do ask a question during the course of the discussion and when we've had our presentations. But I'll start without further ado by handing over to Baroness Parmenter. Kate, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nick. Yeah, I'm going to say a few words about our report, which was the first report of the committee, because we only were established in April 2021. So our starting point was the twin crises, the ecological crisis and the climate crisis, and the fact that the government had set targets for reaching net zero and were about to, well, certainly in the Environment Act said they were going to set targets to address the environmental and ecological crisis, although as we've seen in recent weeks, haven't quite got around to doing that. But nevertheless, they are, statutorily obliged to have targets for the ecological crisis. But they've been far less focused in policy and political terms around the changes that were going to be required to people's lifestyles. And our starting point was the Climate Change Committee had said that 63% of the emission reductions by 2035 were going to be requiring some form of public involvement. Now, they had quite a wide definition of public involvement. It included things around public consent to local authorities making decisions. So we started from that starting point, that there's a crisis, it needed behaviour change and lifestyle change, and it was a high percentage in terms of the Climate Change Committee's analysis of what was needed. And we sat down and said, right, okay, well, what's going to be our definition of behaviour change? What is the evidence about what is acceptable and what is the public appetite for this? What are the government actually doing? And what's the evidence of what's best practice? So that was our starting point. So in terms of those 4 things, we took as our definition getting people to adopt new technologies and accept new services and products, as well as making changes which would mean they adopted less carbon intensive lifestyles. I have to say that definition was not without serious debate. House of Lords Committee is representative of all political parties and none in the Lords, which is one of its strengths. And we have one member who's well known for his views, who rightly challenged us on what the definition of behaviour change was. But that was the definition we took. We felt that was the appropriate thing to do, because even if you're adopting new technologies like electric cars, there are going to be lifestyle changes. I mean, they cost more at the moment. Equally, they're not as flexible as your average diesel car. So we thought that was an appropriate definition, adopting new technologies and cutting carbon intensive consumption. And from that, we identified the figure of it being required. There was a 32% of the emissions reduction by 2035, which would have to come from people changing their behaviours. So it's a new figure out there and a significant figure. It effectively means 1/3 of the changes by 2035 are going to require lifestyle changes. So that's really significant. So the second thing we looked at was, well, what's the public appetite for this? And all the polling evidence we had, and I'm sure Lorraine may go on to say something about this as well, who was a fantastic special advisor, if I might say, to our committee. The people were very clear that they wanted, obviously they're very committed and concerned about climate change, but they wanted government leadership. That they were absolutely clear on. Where there was a slight degree of I suppose, less clarity was when you got round to the granular issues around particular policy areas, and we'll, I'm sure, come on to that in some detail. But the other thing they wanted, other than leadership, was fairness. They were very clear, all the polling's very clear, that people believe that those people who have the largest carbon footprint should make the largest amount of changes. And that will therefore impact on political policy making and some very tough decisions around taxation and fairness around taxation. And that was an issue we did pick up, and we made some specific recommendations about tax changes which reflected fairness, particularly in the context of frequent flying for international flights. We also looked at what works, because I think as a House of Lords Committee, we're expected to base our views on the evidence, rightly so. So we had evidence from around Europe, further afield, Japan, and also academics. And what was very clear was it required 2 things. It requires clear communication, public engagement and communication, absolutely paramount, and making clear what the co-benefits of making these changes are, not just for the environment, but also for people's health, their well-being. In the same way that during the COVID pandemic, there was really clear communication about what was needed and why what you were doing was helping the NHS. So there were some very clear parallels, and we looked in detail at what were the parallels, and we could draw some parallels from the COVID pandemic, which were helpful for our inquiry. But we also found, yes, education was important, but it's not enough on its own. The government has to use all the policy levers at its disposal. It has to use regulation, which I'm sure something that Nick will come on to talk about. Business will be absolutely clear. We need a level playing field to make sure that the businesses can move forward, and the businesses which are making the progress in terms of adopting and producing new green products have a stable and clear regulatory framework. Fiscal incentives and disincentives need to be used, and there needs to be consistency across policy. So communication, but also policy right across the board from the government. And then we looked at actually what the government was doing, and we were quite lucky because soon after we started, the government launched its net zero strategy, which I think I would characterise as behaviour light. There's quite a lot in there in terms of what they're going to do in terms of net zero, but it very, very light on what it wants to say about behaviour change. And it set itself 6 principles, which bluntly the government have not delivered on. It set itself 6 principles to present a clear vision to the public about what they should be doing. Well, it's failed that. Clear regulatory signals, again, don't think we've seen those. to make the greenest choice the easiest and most affordable. Well, again, don't think we've seen any of those. But the bottom line was, it was all about this line of going with the grain of consumer choice. And I think that's the fundamental issue. It's become an issue of ideology. Ideology is driving current policy in this area, because it's all about what is perceived as not wanting to tell people what to do. And whereas previous governments have seen there's a need to tell people what they can then go and choose themselves to do, this government perceives it very much as something that they don't want to step on the freedom of the individual. And it's meant, although we've seen some changes in terms of supporting electric cars, obviously with the very welcome banning of in 2035 of diesel cars, that's really good, and initially some grants, and obviously we've got the boiler upgrade scheme. Other than that, there's very little policy that the government has done in this space because of that ideological fear. And we also looked at the machinery of government, that how government is actually coordinating its policies, because it's no good saying to a member of the public, we think it's about time you insulated your home because of the huge impact that homes have on carbon emissions, if government's still allowing new homes to be built which aren't efficient. I mean, people just note the disparity, and people need to have a consistent policy framework, and the machinery of government isn't working. So I just wanted to say a couple of reflections about what we concluded that the government should do now. Firstly, we concluded it had to refresh the net zero strategy. The fact that it is so behaviour light is not absolutely appropriate, and clearly Chris Skidmore at the moment is doing a net zero review. He came before our committee last week. We submitted some views to him, and he came before us last week. And I have to say, I'm not sure we're entirely heartened that behaviour change is going to get the focus that it needs to if the government's going to meet its own emission and environmental targets. It needs to absolutely, as a first priority, invest in a public engagement campaign. Other nationalities, and indeed Scotland has already introduced one. We can't get people to work on behaviour change unless they know what's needed. So they need to invest in that in the way that they invested and were the largest advertisers during the COVID pandemic. It was a very salutary statistic we had in our inquiry that it was the government that was spending the most money during that time, telling people what was needed. If you want people to do things, you have to give them the information. Thirdly, the government needs to be much better on data. I mean, I always go on the maxim, what measured is mattered. And at the moment, government's not doing enough in terms of measuring the data in this area. So they need to do a lot more. And we had a very interesting conversation with the Chief Scientific Officer about the role of ONS and BEIS in improving data in this area. It needs far more to work with the partners that are out there. We know that the government needs to change its policy, but as I'm sure Nick and Hira will be saying, it can't do this without local communities. Most of behaviour change is place-based. People need to be involved, they need to be engaged, and it won't happen unless business is on the same page. So that's absolutely critical. And then two other quick things. It needs to rewire the machinery of government. I mean, I don't know how many of you noticed, I'm sure most of you did, but the new cabinet committees now don't include the Climate Action Strategy Committee, or indeed the Climate Action Implementation Group. They've been scrapped, and a lower level cabinet committee, which is being chaired by Oliver Letwin, is now in place. The fact that the Prime Minister is no longer chairing a committee which is looking at coordinating domestic and international climate and environmental policy is a major step backwards, particularly in the context of behaviour change, which relies on that continuity across policy areas. You can't have the housing department, doing one thing and, the transport department doing something else. So that, I think, is a major, major worrying point. And I'll just finish on the other thing, which I'm not so sure that the other members may focus on, which is about if we're going to succeed in getting to that figure of 32% of behaviour change. Yes, it's going to be about policy, but it's also going to be about the debate. And since we launched our report, I mean, I've now been called a member of the anti-coalition group, a Puritan, and it's become very ideological and driven and very divisive. And I understand that, it's touching on people's lives, but in the same way that we managed to get the Climate Change Act through, or the Labour government did. It was, it was cross-party. Everybody agreed that this really had to happen. For me, we are not going to be able to solve the behaviour change issue and get people, making the changes to their lives that we know we need to, unless we can frame a public debate which sells the less but better argument to them. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Kate. That was a really comprehensive and clear setting out of the agenda of your committee and the things that need to change. I was very struck there by the last point you make, that how far individual and household behaviour change in particular depends on a broader set of societal commitments, a sense of social purpose societally, and how far that is imperilled by ideological division over action on climate change, and how far, if it's structured into ideological opposition, whether that change is possible. But that's something I'm sure that Lorraine will want to come to. So I'm going to ask Lorraine to speak next. Over to you, Lorraine.
Thanks very much, Nick. And I'll just share a few slides to illustrate some of my points. So I was very privileged to be to support this inquiry, and I'm just delighted about how many of these recommendations are aligned with a lot of the things that we're doing within our centre, the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. And we're absolutely about essentially trying to build the evidence based on how to change behaviour to reach net zero and to change society more widely. As we've heard, technological change is not enough to get to net zero. And actually, one of the figures that I find quite striking is just the scale of behaviour change that is needed. So we need to get to, we're at about 8.5 tonnes of CO2 per person at the moment. That's the average UK carbon footprint. We need to get to 2.5 tonnes in the next, 7 and a bit years. So we need really pretty radical sorts of behaviour changes. And while the focus of the House of Lords inquiry was more on the sort of consumer side of things, that what consumers can do to change their behaviour, and that's, as we've heard, about 1/3 of the emission reductions needed, most of the rest of what's needed will require some degree of behaviour change by people in other contexts. So, for example, within the professional sphere, so what we do within the workplace, what business leaders, what societal leaders do, what we do within communities and as citizens. But the good news is the public is on board, actually, very broadly speaking. So from the government's own polling shows that we're at more or less a record high in terms of climate change concerns. So about 84% of the public saying they're concerned about climate change. And actually similar levels, about 3/4, saying that if individuals like me do not act now to combat climate change, we will be failing future generations. So people do feel that they should be changing their behaviour and playing a part in the net zero transition. But there are barriers, as we've heard, and that came out of the inquiry. And there are many barriers. Some of these you could say are at the individual level. So individuals don't necessarily have a good sense of the scale of change that is going to be required to reach net zero. There is a sense that maybe a bit more recycling, a bit of saving energy, maybe reducing plastic might be enough. And that's partly because a lot of the campaigns that we've had historically are focused on those rather smaller scale behaviour changes. What's absolutely needed now is cutting down on driving, flying, changing diets, much bigger sorts of behaviour changes. And there isn't good awareness amongst the public about the scale of change required, or about actually what's going to be most effective. So we know that there isn't good awareness about the need to change diet in particular, for example. At the individual level, you could also wrap in other sorts of more psychological barriers. People tend to sort of focus on the here and now, and they have other things they're worrying about. And in a cost of living crisis, of course, that's particularly maybe focusing on sort of financial worries that they have. Although, as I'll come on to, there are often win-wins here. So actually reducing consumption, reducing energy use can reduce bills as well as help mitigate climate change. So we need to focus on some of those co-benefits. Maybe harder to address are some of the wider social, structural, economic sort of barriers. very broadly speaking, often it's more expensive or very inconvenient to choose a lower carbon option relative to a higher carbon option. And so this is why we need governments to intervene to reduce or remove those barriers. And we also need business and communities to play their part too. And as I'll mention, engagement is really important. We need to bring people with us because we know that imposing solutions on people doesn't work. One of the useful distinctions that we use, but also was mentioned in the inquiry report, is the difference between downstream and upstream ways of changing behaviour. Downstream is where you're trying to influence individuals' choices directly. So this is usually information provision. So you persuade people to choose a lower carbon option, and that might be through labelling or a campaign of some kind. It might use more sort of social influence type approaches. But what we know is that these tend to be relatively ineffective. They play a part, but by themselves, they often are not enough to actually get people to change their behaviour, often because of these wider barriers that I've mentioned. So what we need is more upstream types of approaches. This is where you're actually influencing the context in which people are acting. So you're actually making it easier and cheaper for people to do the right thing. And they do want to do the right thing, but it needs to be a more natural choice for them to do that. So we need economic incentives and disincentives. We need regulation. We need changes to the built environment. And these sorts of approaches tend to be far, far more effective. And those sorts of measures, of course, as I mentioned, do require government policies to implement some of those things. And this figure comes from some fairly recent polling we've done with Ipsos Mori to try and ask the public, what do you support or oppose various net zero policies, which would have implications for people's lifestyles? So they imply behaviour change. And there are various ones here, but the one that was most popular was frequent flyer levies. And in each case, we gave them a short description of what would be involved. And there is broad support for that. And I think that is partly because, as Kate has mentioned, there is fairness embedded here, actually. It's the polluter pays principle. You pay more in levies for every flight that you take because you're polluting more, the polluter pays, and because higher income people tend to fly a lot more. So there's some level of fairness baked into that policy, and that might explain why that's more that is partly more supported. And you can see that many other sorts of things like changing product pricing to reflect environmental impacts, phasing out gas boilers, electric vehicle subsidies, and so on. All of these sorts of things are more supported than they are opposed. But as we've already heard, actually, the net zero strategy is light on behaviour change. And I'd go further to say that in the forward, it's very explicit that there is no will whatsoever to change behaviour, actually, because there is an assumption that behaviour change implies sacrificing quality of life, that it's about hair shirts, that it's about guilt, and that actually technology and the creative power of capitalism is all we need. And actually, the evidence doesn't bear that out. Not only is technology alone not going to be sufficient, but also actually, the evidence base shows that a lot of the behaviour changes that we're talking about to reach net zero will actually benefit well-being. So this is really important, I think, because this helps to communicate and persuade people about why behaviour change is needed, because actually we know that communication is most effective when it targets what people care about, for example, health, well-being, what's good for their family, etc. And we also know that people that have greener lifestyles, very broadly, so a lower carbon footprint, tend to have higher well-being. This comes from some evidence that we've done across lots of different countries, including the UK, that shows this positive relationship. And so actually going green is not actually about sacrifice, far from it. It tends to improve people's quality of life. So I think this is quite an important piece of evidence that hopefully persuades that behaviour change is not something that we should shy away from. As I mentioned, it isn't only about information. We do need this change of context. We need to change physical infrastructures. We know, for example, that reallocating road space away from cars and expanding the space available for, say, walking and cycling can significantly cut car use because it makes it harder to drive and it makes it much more easy, safe, attractive, etc. to walk and cycle. So those sorts of physical changes really help. Economic measures, of course, can also be very powerful. We've seen some of that happening in Germany recently with their public transport discounts. And we know from the evidence on congestion charging that that can be very effective too. But we do also know that we need to bring people with us, and fairness needs to be really baked into these sorts of solutions. So actually having deliberative approaches, we heard in as part of the inquiry, we actually returned to some of the people that took part in the Climate Assembly UK to ask for their reflections on that process, but also on what government's doing subsequently to that. And it's really important, I think they emphasise the importance of fairness within that process and within many of these deliberative processes. So participatory decision making actually needs to be part of what we do moving forward to help build that social mandate for change. So summing up, we need to focus on those high impact behaviours that I mentioned. So it's not so much about it moving people away from assuming that recycling and plastic reduction is enough, to highlighting the fact that we need to focus on mobility, food, energy and consumption more widely. An expanded definition of behaviour change that thinks about the multiple roles that people have. Co-designing interventions with the public, so that participatory approach that really achieve those co-benefits I mentioned, including well-being co-benefits, and moving more upstream, so not relying on information provision, but actually having a wider set of policy instruments to change behaviour. And I didn't elaborate on this, but actually when we intervene really matters as well. So getting the timing right for when habits are disrupted. We've seen during COVID, people change their habits overnight, and actually some of those things have stuck. So we are doing more things online like this, for example. So actually capitalising on disruptions that happen to try to reconfigure habits is also very powerful. So I'll stop sharing now. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Lorraine. It's a fantastic presentation of the arguments in the agenda here, and actually your focus there at the end on participatory mechanisms, deliberative engagement and participation at the local level in particular is a very good segue for me into Hira's presentation. As I mentioned earlier at the beginning, works with Possible as the head of car-free cities and working at a grassroots level to see that change that Lorraine mentioned of making it better to walk and cycle, easier to walk and cycle, and to make cars obsolete. So Hira, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nick. I think I've got Laura sharing my slides, so that will start in one moment. There we go. So at Possible, we want to see a zero carbon Britain built by and for everyone. And we want to achieve this by inspiring people in the UK to take the action the climate crisis demands. And, you know, as we've just been hearing, the sheer scale of the action required means it's going to touch everyone's lives. If we're going to move at the speed required, and if we're going to ensure the new world that we build is a fair one, we have to bring everyone along. You know, people and communities need to be involved. Politicians, corporations and other established institutions have a key role to play too, but they'll only move fast enough once they know their constituents and customers are on board. So the climate crisis is a collective action problem, and people are fundamentally social beings. So wherever possible, we work to bring people together to take action as both citizens and consumers through a lens that makes clear that they're a part of something bigger than themselves. So as you know, as we've been hearing, the UK's decarbonisation success to date has asked very little of the public, but further progress relies on this changing fast. A powerful expert consensus has emerged around the need for action on the demand side, the social factors that drive consumption and greenhouse gas emissions, with around 2/3 of the carbon cuts needed in the first half of this century, depending on collective behaviour change at an epic scale. Individual consumption patterns are largely a product of the choice environment in which they take place. So changing established behaviours means changing the menu of available options. Meanwhile, the British government remains reluctant to engage the public meaningfully around the societal implications of meeting their own climate change targets. Success in the fight against climate change therefore requires a mass movement that integrates rapid change at the personal, social and structural levels. And everything Possible does is ultimately aimed at increasing meaningful public participation in climate action at home, in our communities and workplaces, and in political engagement too. So there's two key audiences that we focus on. The first is people with high carbon lifestyles and the means to reduce them. So on the global scale, this group includes most but not all people in the upper half of the UK income spectrum, many of whom also registered the highest levels of public concern around the climate crisis. As well as their disproportionate responsibility for lifestyle consumption emissions, this group also enjoys disproportionate levels of agency over solutions, as high socioeconomic status equates directly to influence as agents of social, political and economic change. Those with high social capital can leverage this for the collective interest, extending solidarity to those with less capacity to act, and we can help to guide them into this role. There is therefore both a moral and a pragmatic case for this audience to lead demand-side changes, as change here will deliver the greatest impact in both direct emissions reductions and in changing the conditions in which the rest of society are making their own consumption choices. And then secondly, the people who are currently underrepresented in the climate movement and policy debates. So this broad group includes many communities in the UK whose voices are seldom heard in climate discourse and who may also be at higher risk of being adversely affected by unintended consequences of poorly designed changes to energy and transport systems. The cost of living crisis, now escalating, is likely to dominate public concerns over the coming years, and the enemies of climate action will be using every trick in the book to conscript these concerns into opposition to climate policies. Again, there's both an ethical case and a practical one for positive engagement with this audience group. So that's very broad strokes about Possible and the way we work, but how about some examples of what we do and how we do it? And of course, I'm here to talk about car-free cities. So the Car-Free Cities campaign works in Birmingham, Bristol, Leeds and London and aims to bring to life a positive vision for our cities to move away from mass private car ownership. We want to take space away from cars and give it back to people and nature. We're clear a car-free city is a city which is free of the dangers, pollution and emissions caused by mass private car ownership. It's not a city with no cars at all. We recognise there are many people, including some disabled people, who can't get around without a car, and our aim of fewer cars on the road means more space for those who must drive and better cities for everyone. So, if I was to break it down, what are the kind of key things that we do? If I could get the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So the first thing we do is make the link between the climate and immediate issues to people's lives. Sometimes the climate crisis can seem very far away to people in Britain, although as unseasonably warm days like the ones we've been having become more normal, it's a lot easier to make the case. But nevertheless, for many people, the climate crisis does still feel like it's something over there. It's something to think about later. There are more pressing concerns immediately on their plate. I often say Car-Free Cities is about the climate crisis, but it's also about so much more. It's about the fuel crisis, the cost of living crisis, rail strikes, our health, feeling a sense of pride in our communities. These all intersect when we're discussing car-free cities. And talking about these issues is a way of engaging new audiences in a way that directly relates to them. As an example, our Going Car-Free pilot in January followed 10 drivers, all with a variety of mobility needs, many of them parents, some of them disabled, as they hung up the keys to their cars without significantly changing their everyday routines for 21 days. And what we found is that most of our participants actually reduced their carbon emissions and importantly saved money. All participants reported using their cars less or using alternative modes for some journeys, with some even selling their cars. So the trial demonstrates how a short intervention to reorganise routines can create long-term behaviour change. If I could go to the next slide. The learning and findings from that cohort informed our public Going Car-Free challenge, which had the key message that you could help reduce emissions, save money and become fitter and healthier by reducing your car use. 1,000 people signed up and the post-challenge survey showed that 98% of those who took part are planning on cutting their car use for good. So that was Going Car-Free. The second thing that I think that we do is create opportunities for the silent majority to share their voice. Can I get to the next slide, please? Thank you. Ultimately, we believe that the majority of people want to live in cities where we can breathe clean air, walk around safely, and feel connected to our community. And so despite some of the incredibly loud and divisive public debates around clean air zones, pedestrianisation of high streets and low traffic neighbourhoods, we look to provide the silent majority with opportunities to easily share their opinions. Lots of people are time poor, they can't attend events in the daytime or are unlikely to visit public places. There are multiple barriers preventing people from getting involved in these conversations. And one way to try to reach these people is going door knocking. So last summer, right in the middle of the uproar about LTNs, we recruited volunteers and went door knocking to survey 300 households across Birmingham, Bristol, Leeds and London to ask them their opinions of local, historic modal filters. And we found that 9 out of 10 people love them. So before our survey, nobody had considered asking people of historic filters for their opinions when they had been living with the results of the modal filter for many, many years. And so we also felt really vindicated when at the recent council elections, by and large, candidates who ran on an anti-LTN platform did not win. And the councils that had been pushing for traffic reduction measures came out on top. If I could go to the next slide. Similarly, we helped roughly 5,000 people easily submit responses to the TfL's consultation on the expansion of the ULEZ to all of London in 2023, so that the most polluting cars will be charged for driving anywhere in London. Sadiq Khan has said that this won't automatically go ahead if most responses to the consultation oppose the expansion. So we're looking forward to seeing the results of our efforts off the back of that. And if I could go to the next slide. And finally, we pride ourselves on being great storytellers. We're data-led, we're really good at communicating complex research in an accessible way, but we're also great at creating human-centered stories. And we walk that fine line between numbers and creative moments to deliver a campaign that feels very human. And a great example of this is our work on parklets, which aims to popularise parklets as a positive, people-centered approach to decreasing on-street parking and shifting road space away from cars. So for this, we've produced reports looking at how much space cars take up in our cities. We've launched our Parklet Plotter, which is an interactive map to help people learn about the areas they live in, from which communities have the least access to green space to how different areas measure up against the multiple deprivation index, and identify potential locations for a parklet with maximum social benefit. And we recently produced new analysis showing how car parking is subsidised and prioritised over public space. But beyond all the data, we also create events that bring people together, connect communities and organisations, and spark joy and hope for change. Can I get the next slide, please? Thank you. So for World Car Free Day in September, for 2 years running, we've organised pop-up parklets in our 4 cities. We collectively attracted hundreds of visitors, several councillors come down to showcase their support, and we get loads of great press off the back of it. All of this is in service of calling for an easy parklet permit process in our cities, just in the way that people can apply for a parking permit. We've recently had some success. Waltham Forest's first community parklet was installed in June as part of a 12-month trial so the council can test the permit process. And here's a lovely quote from Toby Spearpoint, who's the resident who applied for the parklet, talking about how great our campaign was in helping him achieve that. Can I go to the next slide, please? And so finally, working on the climate crisis can be a doom-laden affair. It's no exaggeration to say that we're facing the end of the world as we know it. Whether we make change happen or sit back and let change happen to us, human civilization will be transformed almost beyond recognition over the 21st century. We're clear what a grave position years of inaction on the climate crisis has left us in, and know that communicating this is part of our job as a climate charity. But we're also clear that the solutions are there to be seized, and we know it's also our job to promote these too. It's where our name Possible comes from, and at our best, we offer entry points to climate action that are like an invitation to a barn raising. So we all roll up our sleeves, we pick up the tools for the hard work, but we'll be doing it together with friends and neighbours, and there'll be food and drink and music and dancing, and at the end of it all, we can stand back and admire the new barn we've built together. We aim to find joy in the call to action. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Hira. That's very inspiring, and I'm sure everybody watching would have felt exactly the same. And I think really importantly also foregrounding the role of experimentation, of local action, of the ability to make big changes flow from actions that can be taken in a locality by relatively small groups of people, and using experimentation to presage bigger change. So thanks so much indeed, Hira. That was really excellent. Thanks a lot. So our final speaker is Nick Mulhu from the Aldersgate Group. Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. And hello, everyone. So I head up the Aldersgate Group. Just but very brief background, we're a cross-economy business organization that really makes the business case for ambitious climate and environmental policies. So we have around 65 member organizations. Most of them are businesses, but we also have academic institutions and NGOs within the group. And with our members, we really try and look at how policies that can effectively meet our climate and environmental goals can also actually help accelerate investment in innovation, in new supply chains, in job creation skills, and new areas of competitive advantage for the UK. So we absolutely do not see a contradiction between ambitious climate and environmental goals and a prosperous economy. And that's something that we've been working very hard reminding successive governments in recent months. So what I thought I would do today, we fed into the excellent House of Lords inquiry and really want to commend the report. And we focused in particular on the role of business. What does business, what's the role of business in driving behavior change? But also, where does business need help? So what I was going to briefly do is just recap some of the areas where businesses have a role in driving behavior change and enabling behavior change, mention some of the limitations to what businesses can and can't do, which tend to vary between sectors, and then finish with a few suggestions of areas of intervention or priorities for government going forward. So starting with where does business have a role? I mean, there's no doubt that businesses have a huge responsibility in driving and enabling behavior change. So that's absolutely clear. And that's particularly the case for businesses that have a direct consumer interface. And that can be anything from water and energy utilities through to retailers and well-known consumer brands. So there's a range of things that businesses can do, but I think it needs to start at the top. You need to have a very clear sustainability strategy in place, and to be concrete, that strategy really needs to have very clear and ideally science-based targets, whether that's to do with climate through, for example, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, but having other targets around resource efficiency, around biodiversity restoration, and nature restoration are all equally important. And we're very fortunate at Aldersgate Group to have the vast majority of businesses who have such strategies in place. And we do have eligibility criteria in the first place. So we obviously work with the leaders in this space rather than the laggards. But if you have a clear strategy in place, that's already something that your consumers can feel. And it takes you to a second place. It allows you then to offer more sustainable products and more sustainable solutions to your customers. And that's an area where businesses can do an awful lot. Businesses can do an awful lot both in terms of proposing and making those products really accessible to consumers, but they can do also an awful lot to try and provide those at a competitive price and in a way that's very clearly labeled. So we're seeing that with several of our retail members, such as IKEA and Kingfisher. If you go in their stores, so Kingfisher is the owner of the likes of B&Q, for instance, you go in their stores and you will see a wide range of products that are made, for example, secondary materials, or products that are made to last longer, products that have much lower energy consumption compared to standard alternatives on the market, and clear labeling. Even in some difficult sectors like tire manufacturing, we have members like Michelin who design tires who, by their design, are meant to last 2 or 3 times as long as a standard tire, but also are meant to be disassembled and reused to remanufacture other tires up to 5 times. So that's the kind of product design work that businesses have the flexibility to actually incorporate in their business models if they choose to do so. Again, for those businesses that are really exposed to consumer interactions, there's an awful lot they can do through information campaigns in their stores, through the labeling they put together, and making the most environmentally sustainable alternatives really easily identifiable in a store. So where you place a product in your store, for example, has a huge impact on whether or not your customers are going to see it. So there's an awful lot in terms of product placement that businesses can do. I also think businesses have a huge role to play, and that came out a lot with the sort of business surveys we did as we responded to this inquiry. Businesses have a lot to do with in terms of employee engagement. if you have a clear sustainability strategy in place, you clearly communicate it to your employees, you then put your employees in the position whereby they understand what your business is trying to do, and they're better equipped to try and deliver it, especially if they are trained to advise customers on the sustainability of different solutions and products. So in the construction sector, for example, one of our members, Wilmot Dixon, have a sustainability strategy, which is actually the best I've seen in the sector. It's called Now or Never. I'd strongly recommend you have a look at it if you're interested in corporate sustainability strategies. And as part of that, they've run sort of awareness and training courses across the organization, and 95% of Wilmot Dixon in an internal staff survey would say that they understood the objectives and understood their role in helping deliver those objectives. So that's the kind of thing in quite a complicated sector that you really want to see across the piece. But there are, of course, limitations, and there are I sort of identified 4 key limitations. The first one is, and Kate touched on it in the introduction, the importance of having a level playing field for more environmentally sustainable and resource efficient products. So we've seen a range, in some cases you can develop a sustainable alternative at a very similar cost to something that's more carbon intensive that's on the market, and consumers will take it. But in other cases, such as the tire manufacturing sector, the more environmentally, the product that performs better from an environmental standpoint will cost you more. So a company like Michelin, for example, will have often sort of made the point to me that you tend to see that those tires that are there to last 2 or 3 times longer than low quality tires that will tend to be imported from Southeast Asia really struggle when it comes in both the B2B trade and trade with individual consumers, because the upfront cost might be 2 or 3 times more. But actually or 2 times more, over the lifetime of the project, consumers would be financially better off and environmentally better off if they had purchased a more environmentally sustainable tire. So there's clearly a role there for some kind of government intervention. I'll go back there on that point shortly. But we've also seen that in the B2B trade. So a major tire remanufacturer in the UK had to close down a few years ago, and they were focused on retreading tires for heavy goods vehicles, and they were reusing materials 5 times in retreading the tires. So they were making a huge environmental savings as well as creating a lot of jobs in the UK, but they got massively undercut around 2013 to 2015 by imports from China, which were very low environmental quality single-use tires, and a whole sort of an entire plant that was focused on remanufacturing went out of business as a result. So it's there's a real issue here. And if you want businesses to put more environmentally sustainable products on the market, especially in complex sectors, you will often need underlying supporting infrastructure to allow them to do that. So again, sticking with the example of resource efficiency, if you would like retailers, tire manufacturers, and other consumer brands to put forward products that are made of reusable, recycled materials, you need the infrastructure in place to collect waste materials, to process them, and then remanufacture them. And we have too little of that. In fact, in the UK, we have a fairly significant problem with an enormous amount of very valuable scrap material being exported, because we don't have neither the incentive or the infrastructure to collect those scrap materials, recondition them, and reuse them. So we need to address that. And when it comes to, I think, driving behaviour change, through better labelling, I think there's 2 issues that we have come across when looking at different pilot projects that our members have put forward and carried out. One of them is inconsistency of labelling. There are so many product types where there isn't a consistent way of labeling products that it leads to confusion. So a lot of well-meaning businesses will start developing their own labels, but the problem is they need to develop those labels in a way that is scientifically accurate, that is sufficiently simple that consumers can actually understand what they're reading, and doesn't contradict another label that somebody else equally well-meaning in the industry has come up with. So there's definitely a need for intervention there. And a point that's often made to me is that it's quite difficult to change behaviour without a degree of mandation or regulatory driver. So it's not that consumers don't want better environmental alternatives, an awful lot of consumers do, but there are some areas where you need to make it a lot easier for them, and that again is an area for government intervention. So this leads me to my sort of, I guess, final section of what I wanted to talk about, which is where can government help business drive a behaviour change? I think for me that the first thing is around regulatory standards, and I think it really sort of backs up what Lorraine was saying earlier about upstream interventions. If we really want to make it easy for consumers to purchase more sustainable products and solutions, now we need to make them the default choice on the market, and that requires product standards that require minimum degree of energy and resource efficiency. The resources and waste strategy that we have in place is supposed to do that, but next to no progress has been really delivered on that for the last 3 years. So that's a really important area of intervention. And if we want householders to use less energy in their homes, then having regulatory-based energy efficiency standards that mandate that all homes should be of a minimum level of energy efficiency, say EPC band C, by the early 2030s, would be a really strong market signal to get the whole supply chain busy to try and deliver that. And if you time that with fiscal incentives that were timed at moments where homeowners are open to disruption, which again goes back to the point that Lorraine was making, such as stamp duty rebates, that you might find that you could really get the owner-occupier market to take energy efficiency retrofits a lot more seriously and really help them in improving the state of their homes. So that for me is a huge area of government intervention that we really need to see in the coming years. And if we can't do that at a time of cost of living crisis and high energy bills, I'm not sure when we're going to do it. The second area for me is around green public procurement. If we want consumers to make more sort of sustainable choices, but the government should really walk the walk, and through its own public procurement policy should incentivize the purchase of more environmentally sustainable and resource efficient products, but also sort of infrastructure delivery. That's something that has been talked about for a number of years, but again, it's a complex area and one where we've seen very little progress. Labelling, the European Commission has recently been proposing a regulation to try and make product labelling more consistent across different product types. I know it comes from the EU, but I think nonetheless it'd be a good idea to keep an eye on it to see whether we can learn anything from it, and maybe for the Competition and Market Authority, help develop together with industry some simple but meaningful labels for key product types that have the highest environmental impacts, to again make it easier for consumers to understand what it is they're buying and what is the environmental implication of what they're purchasing. I think information campaigns, although that is downstream, I do think has a role as long as you've got the right upstream interventions. I think that's something that's often seen as, oh, it'd be nice to do if we had the money, but we haven't got the money, so we're not going to do it. I do think that sort of a combination of BEIS, DEFRA, and different sort of industry groups really working together to not just help consumers understand the different solutions available to them, to lead a more environmentally sustainable life, but actually making the business case to them, as Lorraine was making earlier, that actually if you adopt these better products and solutions, if you make these changes, you will actually be better off in terms of your overall well-being. I think that would be a really good idea, but it only works if you've made the right upstream interventions where you've made the products and the affordability of those products and solutions as appealing as possible to consumers. So it's all, you know, you can't just focus on one intervention. You have to take a holistic view of all of this. And the final area of intervention for me would be around disclosure. The Treasury about a year ago put forward a quite good roadmap on green finance, which is all around introducing something called the Sustainability Disclosures Requirement. And what that's supposed to do is to get businesses to explain not only how what their exposure to climate change is, but also how they are contributing towards climate change, and to disclose this every year. And the Treasury also committed to introducing a requirement called a net zero transition plans, whereby businesses have to explain, well, here's our contribution to climate change, and here's what we are doing to reduce that contribution and get us to a point where we are truly net zero emission by or before 2050. Now, there have been rumors that this may get slowed down, or the government may not want to go ahead with those. I think it's absolutely critical that we go ahead with that, because good reporting and disclosure really then helps consumers and the public more generally understand what different businesses and financial institutions are doing. And the financial institution bit is important, because when we talk about behavior change and we talk about consumers, we tend to focus more on consumers buying products, but actually one of the biggest interactions between consumer and businesses is actually the relationship between a pension fund and banks and their savers. And savers want to know where their money is going and what the overall environmental impact of their savings is, and how risky their investments are in a world where extreme weather events are becoming more common, and so on. So I think that's an area of intervention that the government must really sort of press ahead with. So those are my sort of, I guess, overall thoughts. The sort of one concluding point I wanted to make is, whilst recognizing that businesses clearly have a very important role in driving behavior change and must really live up to that responsibility, there is a huge role for government leadership. I don't think you can get around that. And the net zero strategy, which Kate touched on earlier, needs to be reviewed and improved over the next 6 months. And that review is absolutely critical, arguably more important than a Chris Skidmore review, because there are a number of gaps in the net zero strategy. There are huge gaps when it comes to buildings, and we touched on that earlier, but there's also huge gaps in hard to treat sectors. So when you're looking at decarbonizing sectors like steel, like cement, or long distance transport, those require huge capital investments, and there is no way those investments are going to happen without clear public policy and targeted public funding to really help businesses invest in the low carbon sort of alternatives that we need them to invest in to give us those low carbon choices. So I think that's an area where the pressure must be kept up on government.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Nick. We bring back gallery view. That's great, Nick. Thanks very much indeed. So you raise a whole set of questions there, really, about capital investment, regulation, institutional reform. I think at the end, indicating perhaps that in some areas this is not about making markets work better, it's about industrial strategy to shift markets in completely new directions, and perhaps also in some areas where you need public ownership, because private ownership will not allow you to deliver what you need. I mean, that's perhaps a discussion we can have in the course of the debate. We've got about half an hour now to do that. There are some questions already in the chat. I haven't caught up with all of them, but there's a few that I wanted to start with our panelists. And the first is a clutch of them that relate to rural areas. And I think it was mention made by, I think, Catherine in the chat, of Climate Assembly in Devon, and the kind of key issue for people there being that car use is almost mandatory for some people because the public transport infrastructure is so poor. The buses are very, very poor, and making the transition towards getting out of cars requires that infrastructure to be in place. So you're in a kind of chicken and egg situation. And others, I think, also asking those questions about how do you make progress on these questions in rural areas where connectivity is weaker, where bus services and others are unreliable, and where then people require a social infrastructure to make the behaviour change. Perhaps I could ask our panellists to address that one first, because I think in each of your own areas you touch on these issues, but perhaps just focusing very directly on that question of rural populations in the UK. Kate, can I ask you to go first, and then perhaps Lorraine?
Absolutely. No, well, people in rural areas have exactly the same needs as people in urban areas, but they have to have different solutions because of scarcity in terms of space, the geography, and they need to be locally tailored. And one of the things that none of us really touched on as much as we perhaps needed to as well in the context of this debate is the role of local authorities in actually coming up with solutions which are right for people in the geography that they are in, and picking up the point that Hira said, it are actually ones where people are engaged in the debate, where people are actually part of the solution. So I think all of us recognise that the needs of rural people are the same, but they're going to have different solutions. The government has a role in coordinating and resourcing local authorities more, because at the moment there's been a real gap in terms of resourcing and coordination with local authorities. I mean, they've only just set up their net zero forum after promising it in the net zero strategy. But I think if you talk to any local authorities, as we did during the process of our inquiry, no one thinks that job is being done properly. So I think there's an issue for government to work better with local authorities, for them to be resourced so that they can actually come up with the solutions which will be very different for people in rural areas.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kate. And Lorraine?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's important to sort of reflect that the behaviour changes that will be needed are different across different groups. And I think here it also touched on kind of socioeconomic differences and the fact that people with higher incomes have much bigger carbon footprints. So we also need to be kind of thinking about that. But the geographical, the spatial dimension is also very important. So having those those multiple and tailored solutions is crucial. In terms of rural areas, we've done work now with Scottish Government, and we're doing work with Cornwall Council as well, looking at how we can change travel behaviours across both urban and rural areas. And actually, while it may be true that it's in some ways easier to get people out of cars within urban contexts, although it's not without its challenges, it is more difficult within rural areas, but it's not impossible, actually. So some of the things that Scottish Government, for example, are doing are looking at, how to combine trips so that you don't necessarily need to take the car so often to go out, that maybe you try to do things a bit more locally if possible, if there are local services being provided, that you do things online where possible, if that is, if an online alternative is available. E-bikes is a solution that Cornwall Council is really championing in terms of trying to get people out of cars onto alternatives that are, that might work in rural areas. So I think there are solutions that maybe don't rely on the car so much, but I agree that maybe cars, and hopefully electric cars in particular, increasingly are less a part of it than in the past.
Great, thanks, Lorraine. Kira, can I ask you about that question too?
Yeah, I was just going to come in, and I agree with everything that Kate and Lorraine have just put forward. I mean, every time I talk about car-free cities, of course, it's the natural question, what about people in rural areas? And you're absolutely right. The reason we're focusing on car-free cities is because, one, that's where the majority of people in the UK currently live, and two, it's the easiest way to get people out of their cars. It fundamentally is harder to do that in rural areas, but as Lorraine just said, it's not impossible. And what I would always come back to is the fact that the lay of the land at the moment is because of policy decisions. We've decided that this is the way we wanted our society to be structured, and therefore we live in this society where some people are locked into car ownership. If we want to reverse that, it is policy that will get us out. So rather than having these huge road building schemes, how about we invest in cycle infrastructure? How about we invest in buses instead of cutting public transport across the board? That goes for urban areas as well as rural areas. So it is difficult. It is more difficult in rural areas, but not impossible. And the only other thing that I would add is within the report, within COP, last year as well, and probably this year, there was a lot of focus on technology and electric vehicles. But I think what that's missing is how electric vehicles might reduce the CO2 emissions, but still have impact on air pollution in terms of particulate matter. Still is just a really inefficient way to kind of build our cities and have people move around. It does nothing for public health in terms of activity crisis and kind of sense of community as well, connecting people. So I would say, I think everything that can be electrified should be electrified, particularly in rural areas, but EVs can't be the answer.
It's a very important debate to be had. Ought to be able to move away from cars rather than simply electrifying them. And over to you, Nick. I think you wanted to come in as well.
Yeah. No, just agree with this point that basically you need a holistic transport solution, not just replacing like for like. But I think just a broader point on rural communities, I think we really need to learn with from what happened in France with the Gilets jaunes crisis. An awful lot of the opposition to President Macron's move to impose a carbon tax, basically on petrol and diesel cars, stemmed from rural communities. And the reason it stemmed from rural communities is they felt that they were being penalized for traveling long distances because they had further to travel to go to work, to connect to urban infrastructure in cities. So I think when it comes to driving behavior change in rural areas, you've really got to come forward with a very clear communication package, proper participatory decision making, as Lorraine was talking about, and whatever disincentive that you might introduce really has to come hand in hand with a credible and realistic replacement solution, whether that be through better public transport, a degree of the minimum infrastructure required to provide, to make electric vehicles a genuine possibility for those who still need to travel by car, and active travel support and so on. But you really need to sort of make sure that the solutions is part of the overall package. Otherwise, you will have a backlash.
Okay, thanks very much. So there's a couple of questions here on communicating co-benefits, and particularly to Lorraine, reference to recent studies in the climate, shared in the climate change sector, suggesting that co-benefit narratives may not be the most powerful for mass public communications, and asking, do you see a difference between communicating co-benefits in a more local, smaller scale way than compared to national level comms? So a question probably, Lorraine, that you're very familiar with, but can you just answer that point? I mean, is it beneficial to argue for the co-benefits of climate action or not? And are there different ways of doing it, local, national?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a growing evidence base here. I mean, more generally, we know that communication works better when it targets what your audience cares about. That's sort of, the staple of marketing, I suppose, as well. And so the more you can kind of get to know what drives and motivates your audience and sort of target that, then the more they're likely to listen. And it's there's a lot of information we're bombarded with every day. So it is about cutting through. So I think I wonder if maybe the question is sort of saying, to what extent should we focus on the co-benefits instead of climate change? And so I can definitely see there's a debate to be had there, because I do think the government, for example, needs to be having a very explicit focus on climate change as part of their engagement strategy. They need to be saying, there is a climate crisis, we need to be transitioning very rapidly, and there is a role that you as individuals and organisations have to play, and this is how you do it, etc., and paint a very positive, inspiring vision, I think, of where we're going, and give people a sense of efficacy and agency to be part of that. And that needs to be explicit about climate change, absolutely, and how we can effectively tackle it. But I think we also need to be saying that there are wider benefits of doing so, and that could be, perhaps that's the sort of thing that could be emphasised more locally, given, as we've said, that solutions will be tailored locally. And so it may be that in a particular locale, then you'll have much bigger air quality benefits, for example, of changing travel patterns than somewhere else, say in a rural area. So those co-benefits probably will differ locally, and so it makes sense to kind of tailor those messages. But I think the evidence is sort of there that actually, we did a study, for example, looking at how to communicate the benefits of reducing meat consumption, and we found that if you combined an environmental message and a health message, it had a more durable effect on reducing people's red meat consumption. So I think the more you can sort of say there are multiple reasons to do this, the more you can probably bring together lots of audiences to listen to that.
Great, thank you, Lorraine. Kate, I just wanted to come back to you on your point about local government, the very important point you make about needing to resource local government effectively, needing to ensure it has the powers required to be able to take the actions necessary. There's a question here, though, about, if you like, the sort of climate change commitments of parish and district councillors, town councillors and others. If you need behaviour change, you also need politicians that are going to, if they're elected, to want to lead that change at a local level. Is there anything you see? I mean, you've got a lot of experience of this, anything you see as being sort of necessary in this area? If you give local government more power, more fiscal powers, more responsibilities, how can we ensure that politicians use those powers effectively?
Well, there's two ways. First of all, you can give them, the honest answer is you can give them duties. But at the moment, some of them already do have duties, but they're not sufficiently resourced to do it. So you can take the view that government can set the sort of the parameters, but it's absolutely critical that local politicians drive this. And that's why, we're talking here a lot about, we talked a lot with young people who are clearly very concerned about climate change and want to see the politicians doing far more. And one of the things I've been saying to them is actually what we need is you young people to be actually being engaged in the political process. Because at the moment, there's a real risk with climate concern that young people have, that actually they're going to be switched off from politics altogether because they think it's, it just can't solve the problem. Whereas actually what we need is young people thinking we need to go into local government and actually be part of the solution. So I think re-engaging young people in, which is, the perennial difficult thing, to try and re-engage people to think actually local government is the right thing for me. If I'm concerned about climate, then actually, I'm going to take this forward as part of my agenda to change things for the better. I think that's a really important point, and one way to target young people's disaffection at the moment with what politicians are doing about climate change is actually saying, come on, for some of you, it might be to go and join Extinction Rebellion. For some others of you, it should be about thinking, become a councillor. I mean, I was a councillor at 21. So, get on with it and make the change you want to see.
Very good. Hera, can I just ask you, I mean, you talked in your presentation about helping people to lobby their councillors to respond to consultations, to engage in their own campaigns. I just wonder if you have any good tips on, really being able to kind of ensure that councillors in city areas, in particular where you work, take the actions necessary.
So I would agree with Kate that I think local councils are crucial in this sort of puzzle that we're trying to put together here. Particularly in the cities that we work in, local councils have a lot of power, particularly over the road space and sort of transport plans and the such like. The problem is, as I said in my presentation, it often requires people to turn up to consultations that are happening, sometimes during the day, sometimes during, different people have different responsibilities. It's all quite technical, and there's so many consultations going on at the same time. It's almost consultation fatigue sometimes. You can't expect everyone to get involved with everything. So the key thing that we do is try to make involvement as easy as possible. And I think that's what made the Parklet plotter such a great success, is that you can go to the map, just click a button where you would like a parklet, and there's a pre-filled form which you can edit and it will send it to your councillor. You don't even need to know who your councillor is, because there's a pre-filled form that will do that for you. And it's the same with the ULEZ consultation. It was actually quite technical. If you don't know anything about the ULEZ, you don't know what the system is or what the process is, we made it really easy for people to be able to fill it in. But at the same time, I think it's an ongoing conversation that will work for some people, whereas for other people, it's not about filling in a form. They want to see tangible change in their communities and in their neighborhoods. And that's what makes Parklet so brilliant, is that it is giving, we're saying we're taking a parking space away, but we're giving something back to so many more people. This is access to public space. You're getting a garden, you're getting seating. It is about making those benefits more tangible to people. And yeah, I think local councillors do actually quite a good job in quite tough circumstances. But we're all about supporting them with the data they need, with the messaging they need to, and kind of saying to them, you can go ahead. The public is on your side. And local council elections kind of showed that. Not anyone. There were notable exceptions, Tower Hamlets being one, but most people who stood on an anti-LTN agenda did not get re-elected or get elected into power, and I think that says something.
Yeah, absolutely, and there were very specific circumstances in Tower Hamlets, as we know. I'll mention it just because it's in the Q&A, that Sian Ellis-Williams refers to a tool that's being developed by My Society to help citizens estimate the I presume the carbon footprints of contracts let by local authorities, so the public procurement point that Nick was making, and whether you can then lobby to improve council procurement on the basis of transparency about the carbon footprints of contracts. So that seems very interesting. Nick, there's a few questions here related to the issues you raised about capital costs and helping people with the upfront costs of making the changes they need to see. And we've had over a decade now really sort of failure, particularly on home energy efficiency, green homes and those other kinds of mechanisms designed to help people with the upfront costs of shifting away from gas boilers and making their homes more energy efficient. I mean, is this something where we just need a completely different policy framework, or are there just things that are obvious that we're not doing to enable people to get rid of their gas boilers and to invest more in their energy efficiency?
Thank you. Well, I think more looking at sort of home and energy efficiency as a whole, I think we've known what the right framework is for about 20 years. It's just we've never actually tried to implement it. And instead of implementing something that's really comprehensive and long-lasting, we've essentially resorted to a program of stop-start grants, which had a degree of impact when you introduce them, and then the minute the cash runs out, nothing else happens. And you can see that actually if you look at the installation rates in 2012 and you then look at the home installation rates in 2013, you'll see a 90% drop. And there's a diagram that shows you that in the latest progress report from the Committee on Climate Change. So we have a major problem. I think that what we really need is the sort of overall framework that has about sort of 4 key pillars. The first one is regulatory. We need to be absolutely clear what the regulatory ambition is when it comes to energy efficiency in homes, because there's no other way businesses will understand what the market opportunity is without it. So, you know, I would say, social housing, you want to get everyone to EPC band B or C at the latest by the early 2030s. And when it comes to owner-occupier homes, no later than 2035. But you need a very clear statement of regulatory ambition. You then need fiscal incentives, so the carrot, so to speak, to facilitate that transition. That can mean VAT rebates from home improvements. Now, interestingly, the government did introduce one, except that the VAT rebate is only applicable if a professional installer does your home energy efficiency improvement, even if it's something quite simple. If you do the installation yourself, you're not going to benefit from the discount. So that's the kind of thing that needs to change. Stamp duty rebates, I think, are really critical for the owner-occupier market. So you need those well-timed fiscal incentives that work hand in hand with your regulatory drivers. You then need to, I think, a system of certification. I think a big concern when it comes to heat pumps, when it comes to energy efficiency installation, is people are not sure what the quality of the work is. So I think labels that people can trust are going to be really important. And then for me, a 4th pillar is really around having an information one-stop shop. And that's where local authorities are so important, as long as they are sufficiently well resourced to provide you with the information you need to understand when and how do I need to insulate my home, when and how can I replace my gas boiler with an electric heat pump, and what might the unintended or knock-on impacts be. And, actually, what should I do about having an electric charging point if I want to move to an electric vehicle? Having a one-stop shop with a trusted, I guess, source of information, and local authorities tend to be really trusted by local residents, is, I think, really important to make this right. And when it comes specifically to heat pumps, then I think, as part of the incentives package, you need to look beyond just the incentives. I think a degree of subsidy, especially at the moment, is going to be important to help with upfront costs. Especially if it's, that's why I think the renewable heat incentive was not badly conceived, because you got some support and then you repaid the support as you saved on energy bills throughout the duration of you using your heat pump. So I think something like that, as part of a really well-structured regulatory certification and clear information framework, could really help move the dial once and for all on a home energy efficiency.
Okay, great, thank you, Nick. That's very helpful. Now I want to turn to a question that Jackie Head has raised towards the end of our chat about airport expansion, which is obviously an issue in Bristol, but also more widely the issues that both Kate and Lorraine touched on at the beginning about just transitions and frequent flyers basically being responsible for very high per capita carbon emissions by long distance and other flights on a much more regular basis, and whether we now need to just, give up. Jackie's question basically is to say, why don't you abandon the idea that you're going to get, different kinds of fuel, and actually just tax flights and get people out of planes and get them using other modes of transport, and particularly given the contribution, per capita contribution to carbon emissions that comes from flying frequently. Perhaps Lorraine and then Kate, I can ask you to have a think about that question.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And I'm glad this question has come up, because I do think aviation and flying is one of the most difficult areas really to tackle in some ways, but I completely agree. We've heard very clearly that we need government leadership and we need consistency. And so it doesn't make sense for the government to be saying that climate change is a priority and we have a net zero strategy, and then people saying that airports are being expanded and that the duty paid on domestic aviation fuel is being reduced. That policy was announced during COP26 when we had the presidency of the UN climate talks. It completely mixed messages, and to be expanding airports, this seems like the lowest of all low-hanging fruits to me. Do not expand airports. Do not invest in oil and gas. These are things that we should just be doing immediately, and then we can go on to all these other really important things very quickly that we need to be doing. But it just seems absolutely a no-brainer not to be doing that. And then, of course, it's important to invest in technologies like aviation fuel that is less polluting. I think we need to be doing that. But in the meantime, we need to be encouraging people to be flying less and then investing that money that we get through something like a frequent flyer levy in sustainable alternatives and investing in the UK tourism industry. There could be lots of green jobs there. So I think there could be lots of win-wins, but at the moment, there's just no progress.
Thanks, Lorraine. Kate.
Well, can I absolutely echo what Lorraine has said? The only thing I would add is that, and there are other countries out there who are taking these steps, which are going down well. I mean, Nick talked about the Gilets jaunes where there was a bit of a backlash on some issues, but the French have now introduced a ban on flights across the country if it can be undertaken within 2 hours by bus or by train, and it's gone down well. And so, I think there is a real case that if the government is going to take forward this agenda of fairness, and I think it's, and Lorraine will shout at me if I've got this wrong, but it's 70% of the flights are taken by about 17% of the population. It's an issue where you really need to show that those who have got, we're not saying people can't fly, we're just saying there will be an extra cost. And we saw with the plastic bag tax, actually, that when people could see the arguments for it, an increase in taxation, which is seen to be fair, actually works. So I think this is, as Lorraine has rightly said, low-hanging fruit, and other countries are tackling it, and so should we.
Great. Okay, there's a sort of, I mean, we're coming towards the sort of end of the time we have, and there's sort of a bit of a thread running through some of the questions. I mean, I can't take each of them in detail because we've got too many, but a bit of a thread running through some of them, which is, how do you tell when something is basically greenwashing, when it's when what companies or governments or others are saying, which is effectively greenwashing, and how do you judge that against information you get which you want to act on, should act on, which is genuinely about reducing your emissions or those of your household? So I suppose this question of sort of filtering out what is ideology or what is corporate interest dressed up as climate action from sources of advice, information, sources of genuine guidance that you want to use to act on yourself, so that people can make decisions about things which which is, and obviously very good examples of this come in sort of offsetting, that you press a button to enable you to offset the cost of your flight or offset this, offset that, which in reality then turn out not to be actually genuinely reducing carbon emissions. So perhaps you could say that the panel could just help us a bit with that question as well, before we come to the end of the session today. So I'll start perhaps with Nick on that.
Thanks, Nick. So it's a complex one, but I think for me there's two sort of things that spring to mind. The first one is really around having much more of far more effort being poured into consistent labeling for specific product types or solutions. That's something where there's good evidence that actually businesses and consumers trust some independent certifications like FSC, for example, and to a degree MSC, but there's not enough of those across key sort of product and solutions. And that's why I think bodies like the Competitions and Markets Authority could have quite an important role in helping develop greenwashing proof set of labels, so you could really understand when you're purchasing a service or a particular product how environmentally sustainable or not your product is. I think closely linked to that, I think it goes back to my point on reporting and disclosure. What the government is consulting on, or developing at the moment, is a framework which would require businesses to explain what their contributions are to climate change and what they're doing about it, especially through the net zero transition plan. I think really developing a robust framework here is going to be important, because that would require on an annual basis. It would enable society to really monitor the progress or absence of progress from different corporate players. Closely linked to that, there's another important initiative that's happening at the moment, which is the development of a UK green taxonomy. It's an awful term, but basically what it's about is developing a set of sustainable investment definitions to help individual savers and bigger investment firms to understand what's a sustainable investment and what's not a sustainable investment. So again, that work's been delayed with all the political shenanigans in recent months, but really completing that work, I think, will be important, and trying to align it as much as possible with what the EU is also trying to do on the same issue.
Great, thank you very much, Nick. That's very helpful. Kate, can I ask you to have a go at that question?
Well, I absolutely agree with Nick. It's around the issues of getting the government to take the lead on labelling. It's been far too slow. In fact, it's been far too slow on so many issues in the last sort of 5 years. Extended producer responsibilities, labelling, they need to get much, much faster. Just on the issue of the UK green taxonomy, which Nick finished up with, I'm really worried. They're going far too slow on this, and they keep saying, I mean, the consultation on this was due at the beginning of the year, Q1, and the markets need rapid signals, and if they're not getting rapid signals from this new government, then we really have to worry. So yeah, consistent labelling, consistent disclosure, and then that should allow other actors like the Advertising Association and others to take steps to stop some of these rogue companies that are undoubtedly at the moment still out there doing greenwashing.
Thanks, Kate. Lorraine.
Well, agree. And I think the only other thing I would add is that while we absolutely need clarity on which green claims can be trusted, there's just that sort of slight caveat that obviously information by itself isn't often enough to change behaviour. We also need those wider changes that we've talked about in terms of kind of enabling the price of greener products to be reduced. But I think, that can be part of it, because as people kind of start to see which are the genuine claims, then hopefully that might start to sort of create a bit of a shift, and as well as an incentive within businesses as well to innovate in that direction. So yeah, that's what I do.
Great, thanks, Lorraine. And perhaps here I could just give the last word to you. I mean, I've got just this or any other questions that we may not have addressed that you want to tackle in the last couple of minutes that we have.
I mean, the one thing that I would add is the kind of being possible and trying to be positive. There is the slightest of silver linings with greenwashing is that it's no longer acceptable to say that, yes, we're polluting the world and we don't really care, which is why corporations are kind of doing this. What we do need to do is ensure that the sustainable impacts that they claim are having the impact in the world that we want them to have. I think there does need to be stronger regulations and stronger legislations around the sorts of terms that are being thrown around. But also, we do need to, I think corporations and governments need to see that people care about these things, and that will make them do more. It needs to be on the agenda. And hopefully that's what we're all here to do.
Great. Thanks very much indeed, Thera. That's great. We're going to, I think, try and post in the chat the link to the House of Lords report, to the committee's report, so that those of you who haven't read it yet or want to get access to it can easily do so. So you can see all the recommendations there. It's very recently published, and I think the government is required, isn't it, Kate, to formally respond to the report. They have to respond to it. Yeah. So that we'll see in that response precisely how they intend to account for the challenges that have been posed and the issues that have been raised. That's come up, so yes, you can click on that link now that Laura has circulated that should enable you to get through to the report. It just falls to me really now just to say thank you very much indeed to everybody for participating today. We've had I think at one point 140 of you on the call, so it's great to see so many people engaging with the event today. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and do keep in touch with the Lords Committee, with CAST, with the IPR, with the Aldersgate Group, and with Possible as well, about all the work they're undertaking. There are plenty of other events and debate and discussion happening in this space all the time, so please do keep in touch with it. But I just want to finish by thanking Hera, for thanking Nick, Lorraine and Kate Parmenter for their presentations and for answering all the questions so fully and comprehensively. So a big thank you to you all for your presentations and answers today. I think that's probably everything from me. Again, just to thank you all for participating, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks very much indeed.